Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are having our episode of the week of December 29th, which is our last episode of the year. And we are glad to have a great episode that we're going to learn more about Thomas Becket, or Thomas Becket, as he is sometimes stylized and known, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury and who actually was murdered on December 29th, 1170. On this very day that the podcast is launching. And we're very glad to have Professor Michael Staunton with us, who is with University College Dublin in Ireland. And he is a professor of history there that focuses on medieval history. So, Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So, tell us, for those who maybe never watched a movie that some of us would have watched growing up, right, with Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, I think were the two stars of that movie. The story of Thomas Becket as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and certainly the Canterbury Tales are something that are very familiar to so many of us. But before we get to that, tell us a little bit more about Becket and who he was, and maybe also about his relationship with the future king, Henry II.
Oh, now that you mentioned the movie Becket, that starts when Thomas is already in his grave. And most people, when they start talking about Thomas Becket, they begin with his murder, because that's what he's most famous for, his murder
Sure.
at Canterbury Cathedral in December 29th, as you said, 1170. And it's from that time that people start to tell his story, and they tell it in various different ways. There's more written about Thomas Becket than about any English person of the Middle Ages. So we
Wow.
have all of this material telling his story. Everybody will tell it a little bit differently. So this is my quick version of it. Thomas was born in London, either in 1118 or 1120. He came from a reasonably well-off background. His father was a successful merchant, and his mother, named Matilda, they were both from Normandy. Significantly, he didn't come from a noble background, though, and this is something that it comes to be of consequence later on during his life, when he starts to mix with this more elevated company. He's born in London. This is the aftermath of the Norman conquest of England. London is a very thriving city. He is educated. He's clearly very smart. There's no very early signs of a religious vocation by most accounts. So the ways that you can be successful in this world, if you're not from a noble background, it's usually by being educated. So he goes to Paris. He goes to Paris, which is at this point the most exciting intellectual world of Europe at the time. And but he doesn't shine as a student. In fact, he drops out after a year, and he comes back to England, gets a job as an accountant,
Hmm.
then eventually starts to work his way up through the ranks of various kinds of jobs. He becomes a clerk working for the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is his big break. He becomes the part of the administration of the Archbishop. And then eventually he becomes the royal chancellor. So this is a very major position within the kingdom. And he's doing this against a background of some quite turbulent political times.
Mhm.
He's grown up during a time that is known to historians as the anarchy. And this is a period of 19 years when you have a sort of low-level civil war between two claimants to the throne. One of these claimants is a young man called Henry Plantagenet, or Henry of Anjou. And from this, you get the dynasty alternatively called the Plantagenets or the Angevins. And his name is Henry, and this is the man who will become of such importance to Thomas. Henry is a little bit younger than Thomas. Uh, he's a very um, uh, impressive figure. very impetuous, but also very capable. He invades England at the age of 14. And during Thomas's time working as a clerk for the Archbishop of Canterbury, he gets involved in brokering a peace between the two sides, and he facilitates the succession of Henry to the throne of England as King Henry II. And the year is 1154. Henry II asks around about who he should staff his administration with, and the Archbishop suggests this bright young man, Thomas Becket. He's a little bit older than Henry. Henry's only 20 at this time, but he's not that much older. So this
Can I ask you a question real quick on that while we're doing that? So was there a thing called as we know it now, or we understand, was there kind of a privy council that would have been around the king at that time? And so he's trying to put together, for those of us on this side of the pond that don't understand all that maybe necessarily, he's putting together his cabinet, right? He's putting together his core group of people that are really going to help him run the government, and he's trying to find the brightest and the best and the loyalist, right, that will actually be a part of what he's trying to. Is that a fair?
That's exactly it.
Okay.
So the main people are, you have the chancellor, you have certain other senior figures, and the chancellor is the person who runs the writing office. And at this time, writing is becoming particularly important. So this is an important office in itself. But it also is particularly important because of the bond between Henry and Thomas. So they are seen as being two allies in reform of the kingdom. So when Henry comes to the throne, he wants to shake things up. He wants to say, I'm going to bring back law and order after the anarchy. I'm going to make sure my enemies are submissive to me, all of these kinds of things. And Thomas is very much involved in this. So they take measures to reform, say, coinage, to reform public safety. There's the development of the common law really comes from this time. This is the most important phase.
Okay.
And this is the background to what will be the dispute. But as yet, Thomas and Henry are very close. And they're not just close as political allies, they're friends as well. So the picture that we have, and this is written by Thomas's own biographers, people who witnessed it, they talk about Henry and Thomas as the greatest friends that there ever were in Christian times. Wow. They talk about them going out hunting together, feasting together, generally carousing together. And there's all of these descriptions of, Henry comes into Thomas's court, jumps off his horse, jumps over the table, they're wrestling together, all of these kinds of things. And you can see that maybe part of this from Thomas's point of view is because he comes from this non-noble background. He really takes to this with a great enthusiasm. So it's this personal bond and it's a kind of a political bond. As yet, there's no great sign that Thomas is any different to any of the other people in, let's call it a cabinet. It's a good description. Or his court. He is living the same kind of life. And he is loyal to Henry. And when Henry needs a new Archbishop of Canterbury, it's obvious where he's going to look. So this happens in the year 1162. Thomas's old boss, Archbishop Theobald, dies. And there's a bit of time between his death and the appointment of Thomas. It's quite possible that, Henry might have had some doubts about it. But if anybody had any doubts about Thomas being an archbishop or any criticisms of him as a potential archbishop, it was that he didn't seem religious enough. And even Thomas himself seems to have had this view of himself. Again, this is from one of his biographies. When the news comes to him that Henry wants to make him archbishop, he's playing chess and he's wearing these elaborate clothes with, bright colors, ornaments hanging from them in a very noble style. And he says, me, looking like this? Is this the kind of guy that you want as an Archbishop of Canterbury, as leader of the church in England? And so,
And maybe not only that, do I want to give this up because I
do
want
I want
to
to
go
give
to
this up?
I
That's
kind of
right.
like all these bubbles on me, and I like to
Yeah,
be able to drink my wine. I like to be able to do
that's
what I
it.
want to do, and I don't know if I want to give that up or not.
That's it. And of course, there had been bishops and archbishops in the past who didn't give it up all that much. They managed to retain their archbishop, but they lived a fairly secular life. They grew fat on the riches of Canterbury and so on. He
Mhm.
had those predecessors. When he was appointed, uh, he wasn't yet a priest. He was a clerk. So to be to work in the archbishop's household, he was part of clerical orders. So
Mhm.
he was set apart from the rest of society. He wasn't supposed to go to taverns, for example. He wasn't supposed to play boisterous games, though he may have done a bit of that. He could have got married even, but he wasn't a priest yet. So he was made priest the day before he became archbishop. Then he's consecrated archbishop. And even at the time of his election, there's some murmurings against this person is too close to the king. And this person is not sufficiently religious, not sufficiently learned, also a certain amount of snobbery because of his background. So, in particular, the Bishop of London voices his opposition, but it doesn't matter. It's really, even though officially it's the decision of the bishops and the monks of Canterbury, it's really Henry is saying, "I'll accept anybody as long as it's my choice, Thomas." So Thomas is consecrated, and something dramatic happened then. What exactly it was, people have been debating ever since. We know that he changed his attitude towards Henry, but the difficult thing to understand is why exactly that happened. Now, again, his biographers, writing after his death when he was already hailed as a saint, they claim that he underwent a dramatic conversion. They say that once he had become archbishop, once he had been anointed, he started to, he was touched by the hand of God. He started to put off the old man, put on the new, and he changed his own behavior. So they say that he started to wear under his archiepiscopal garb, he would wear a hair shirt. That is
Oh,
a piece of rough cloth that would cut into his flesh. And he above that he wore a monastic habit. But all of this was secret. Now, this is a very difficult claim to deal with because if it was secret, nobody saw it and nobody talked about it until after his death. But his biographer said, well, this is an even greater thing because out of humility he kept it secret. So people could see on the outside the face of this, important bishop, archbishop, all of this, friend of the king, but beneath everything was different. Whatever about that. And, who knows? People debate it, people wonder whatever way. There must have been some personal change within him. We know that he started to take a different attitude towards the king.
wow.
And
Hey, we're enjoying our conversation here with Professor Michael Staunton, and we're talking about Thomas Becket and his role as Archbishop of Canterbury and his martyrdom and his impact on Christianity, particularly in through medieval Christianity. So at that time period. So for us just to kind of keep this in mind, we're well ahead, 400 years ahead of anything that would be the break of England from the Catholic Church, right? So we're really talking about the Great Schism that would have happened with the Orthodox Church had already been pretty much taken place, and so, but that didn't mean though that whoever was the ruler, um, typically the king, but some queens, right, that would have been in some of these other spots. They still had an enormous amount of influence, right,
mhm,
with Rome and with others
yeah,
about what they were. And so it probably hadn't grown to the spot where there was a, you know, you're going to do what I tell you to do. No, you're not going to do what I
Mhm.
tell you to. Struggle, although those things were certainly building up. But this is one of those examples where the bishops and the others within Canterbury are going to go, well, we may have our own opinion, but we're not going to let our opinion get too far ahead of the king on
Yeah,
who we might think. Is that a fair way to say that?
that's absolutely right. Because now one of the important elements of background to this is that in the late 11th century, so we're talking about sort of 60, 70, 80 years before, you start to have, for the first time within the medieval church, some kind of clash between secular and spiritual power. And this is partly bound up with the developing power of the papacy. So over the previous, 3/4 of a century, you'd have you've had various popes and people who were around them claiming authority over areas that they might have claimed before, but they had never really made as a reality. So you have, for example, by this time, if you're an abbot or you're a bishop or some other senior church figure in England, you can appeal over the head of the king to the Pope because the Pope is extending his jurisdiction into England, into various other places, whereas previously it was just confined mostly to Italy. So there's also a kind of a sense that spiritual power is superior to secular power. Those kinds of ideas are in the air. Thomas would have heard them when he was in Paris, especially amongst various theologians. But there's still a kind of a pragmatic sense for most people within the church, as well as those people around the king, that they work together, that they generally have a balance of power, that there's an alliance between them. There'll always be certain difficulties here and there, but there's no real attempt, or there hasn't been a serious attempt in England before this to say, these are the powers of the church, these are the powers of the crown, but here is where you get it. And it starts over fairly small things. So you've got a few skirmishes between Henry and Thomas over things like taxation,